I think aspiring to where I was going, I wasn't really sure where that was. And there's always a risk when you start putting numbers to things that people think, oh, that must be real. You've called that 5, it must be 5.
Confirmation bias.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about the person that you're counselling, it's not about you. Don't just think, oh, I've had that problem before, I know what the answer is, because that was the answer to your problem. It's not necessarily the answer to their problem. And we as a community have a responsibility, I believe, to look after those people.
Welcome to Not the Rob Bell Podcast, where we talk with business owners, marketers and professionals to extract what makes people and businesses successful.
Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Not the Rob Bell Podcast. Today's guest, I've got Julia Lessing from Guardian Actuarial. We learn just what it is that an actuary does, how mathematical magic makes the world go around, and how emotional intelligence can inform powerful decisions. All that and more coming up now. So Julia Lessing from Guardian Actuarial, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Rob. Really excited to be here.
I think there's some really interesting things, and they might have picked up from the company name that you're an actuary. And I think we'll dive into what that actually means a little bit later. But first up, can you give us a little bit about Julia Lessing and your professional history and take us through that journey of your professional life?
Sure. Thanks, Rob. So I guess my professional history starts back in the high school days when I was making decisions about what to do with my life. I was really good at maths, and I guess the obvious choice was to be a maths teacher. My mum thought that was a really great thing to be a teacher because then you have school holidays off with your children. But I'm not really a fan of like other people's children too much. So,
fair call. Yep.
I love my own. But the idea of teaching, I just thought, I enjoy teaching, but teaching other people's children, the money didn't sound that great. So I sort of started exploring what else could I do with those math skills. And my 4-unit maths teacher said to me, have you thought about doing actuarial? And I had no idea. I had no idea what an actuary was.
Like most people.
Most people. But, you don't have to read too far through the UAC guide because actuary starts with A. So, you get past accountant, you think that looks a bit boring, and you get to actuary and you think, oh, that could be, that could be an option. So I liked the idea of being able to put numbers to things that haven't happened yet, being able to quantify stuff that will happen in the future. And so that's where it started.
So that's where it started. And so your 4-unit maths, obviously you had a talent for mathematics out of the gate if you had a 4-unit maths teacher. And so what was that clinch point of, really affirming that this is what you wanted to do? I think you're probably going to explain that it is quite a journey to become an actuary.
Yep.
What really set the tone for taking on that challenge?
Yeah, look, I think, I went to a selective high school, and when we were in year 12, it was just all about maximising the TER or the ATAR as the kids call it these days, choosing the subjects that were going to scale you well. It was all about what will you do at uni, not what are you doing next year? And I guess, it seemed like there was some prestige that came with being an actuary. Not many people knew what an actuary was, and there was a bit of appeal around that. I sometimes kick myself around that these days because it's very frustrating when people ask you what you do and you tell them and they just kind of look at you blankly like,
move on to the next
question.
Yep.
But I probably just got, to be honest, I probably just got swept up in the wave. We were headed towards uni. We knew what subjects we were good at. We knew what opportunities we had available to us based on those subjects that we were good at. And you just followed the path. We just followed the path to university and got stuck into the actuarial studies.
And I mean, it's been quite a windy path, or at least a long path, from what I understand. And your professional credits include work at EY, Munich Re, Zurich, and then ultimately founding Guardian in 2015.
Yep.
That's some really big companies. What's it like transitioning from, aspiring to be something to going through that degree process and ultimately landing where you'd intended?
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question, Rob, because I think aspiring to where I was going, I wasn't really sure where that was. And in my first year of university, as a first-year actuary, still not quite sure what actuaries did at that point, but working through my exams, I actually got married and shortly after fell pregnant with my first baby. So that then sort of took life on a bit of a different bit of a detour, I suppose.
Sure.
And actuarial kind of became part of the background that was, this is what's going to ultimately support my family. This is what's ultimately going to give me that long career path. And, I'd always wanted that sort of suit and high heels kind of job. So knowing that I would have one of those corporate careers and work for those big companies and help clients in the big end of town, that was quite appealing. So that was sort of where it started. And I guess in parallel, raising a small family at the same time meant that I was always making decisions about how could I continue that career and continue to climb the ladder while also balancing that with my young family.
Certainly a balance, no doubt.
Indeed.
And so for anyone who's listening or watching this, just as you were trying to figure out when you were entering university, can you give us the Cliff Note version of what is an actuary and what do you actually do?
The Cliff Note version. Well, the short answer is actuaries do different things. We use data. We're good at understanding the context around a problem and being able to look at the data and do some cool maths around how to solve that problem or get some insight into that problem based on the data that's available. Sometimes the data's incomplete or relates to things that haven't happened yet. So we use probability and statistics and our understanding of economics and finance to be able to bring together a whole lot of different angles when we're looking at data to be able to solve problems.
So when we think of, say, EY, Zurich, things like that, the actuarial explanation that you've just given us kind of does fit into that pattern there. But does it extend beyond just financial modelling and what you would sort of assume that leads to?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that really differentiates actuaries from other quantitative professionals. We are kind of the jack of all trades when it comes to different mathematical techniques. Some actuaries see themselves as data scientists or, get into some really heavy coding and different analytical techniques and machine learning. And certainly that's an area where actuaries are getting more into as time goes on and as data sets get bigger and data analysis techniques become more complex. But really, I think what distinguishes us as actuaries is our ability to look at the context around a problem and to look at different scenarios or the way things might play out, different options in terms of how things might play out in the future, not just what's happening right in front of us, what happened last year, but being able to set assumptions and make predictions and, really bring some insight from the data that's available, but also being able to supplement that with our understanding of the context and our professional judgment around what else is important in that context.
It really opens the eyes a little bit into just how broad you've given us a rough explanation of what an actuary is, but it sounds like it's a little bit like saying someone's a doctor. They may be an ear surgeon. They may be a general practitioner. What areas of actuary do you focus on, and how does that kind of fit into what you enjoy?
Yeah, good question. So the path to becoming an actuary is very long. And as you get towards the end of that path, you specialise into different kind of actuarial services. So, typically actuaries come out and become qualified as either a life insurance specialist. So they know everything about life insurance and the maths that goes behind there and the mathematical techniques in terms of pricing and reserving around life insurance, how insurance works in the industry and in the location and jurisdiction that they work in. Same goes for general insurance actuaries or health insurance actuaries. Typically, actuaries work in financial services or banking, wealth management, superannuation, so those sort of financial-based type industries. So by the time you get qualified, you usually fall into one of those specialty type areas, and that's where you will carve out your career. There are a number of us, though, who, whilst we have gone through those traditional paths to become qualified, we're using those actuarial skills in different areas. So at Guardian Actuarial, we help senior leaders use data to help solve complex people-oriented problems. And by that I mean, we might be looking at workforces, large workforces, the well-being or the staff retention around that, and what data is available to derive insights about why are people leaving, or what do we need to attract good staff, or how do we need to improve staff wellbeing. But we also do work for government agencies as well, looking at their workforces who might deliver services to community groups, whether that's child protection services, whether it's health, other clinical services, whether it's NGO community services. There's a whole lot of different applications where we can use those actuarial techniques outside of financial services and superannuation and wealth management to be able to make a difference.
So it really sounds like, even though it may be applied in different ways, I know from my experience, we're good at, say, taking a marketing campaign's data and looking at, the success of that in probably a very rudimentary way compared to what you would do. But it sounds like you guys are really forecasting and looking further into the future with more of a predictive modelling sort of lens than just looking at what's at hand. Is that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, if we were looking at, for example, so in your marketing example, if we're wanting to look at some data about what's sold in the past and how things have sold or what sort of factors drive different sales, that's helpful to the extent of what's available in that data set. But if there's certain factors that apply, let's say that data set comes from America, in a completely different context and completely different culture, completely different behaviours. It's a real data set, but it might not necessarily translate well when you're looking at insights as to how things might occur here. So I think it's really important to be not just looking at what's the data analysis technique or what's the data set, or are we using machine learning or artificial intelligence or any of those really cool, well, I think they're cool.
That's my jam.
All these really cool techniques. At the end of the day, if you've got data that doesn't make sense, or it doesn't reflect what you're looking at, or it doesn't make sense in the context of your problem, it doesn't matter how cool data analytics techniques that you've got available at your disposal, you're just going to get rubbish coming out. So again, I think that's where actuaries can add value, because we are really good at the maths, but we're also really good at understanding the problem and the context of the problem, to make sure that we're not just crunching some numbers and coming up with an answer that makes sense in a certain context that doesn't actually apply to the problem at hand.
So I understand that you have a real strong people focus around people-based problems in data. How does that throw up new challenges that, say, actuaries working against stock markets or something that is a little bit more predictable? How does that human element factor into sort of that wild card factor?
Yeah. I think that wild card factor actually applies to more industries than we realise. I think even when, sometimes you can have a false sense of security in an industry where you have numbers, you have things that you can measure. And you start to think, oh, this is all very scientific. And there's always a risk when you start putting numbers to things that people think, oh, that must be real. You've called that 5, it must be 5.
Confirmation bias.
Exactly. So, understanding psychology, understanding the human behaviour, I think that's a really important part to being able to understand problems, but also make sure that you've got a solution that makes sense and fits. And one of the things that actuaries are really good at is understanding complexity. So, if you're looking at a data set, we've got a project we're working on at the moment, and we've got times of certain activities, right? And we're trying to understand what's the relationship between different factors that can tell us whether or not a certain activity takes longer or shorter. So we're looking at different factors, but and you can work out what those factors might be by understanding the context, understanding the industry, talking to people and experts in the space to really understand the context. But sometimes those factors are connected. So what if you've got two factors that both increase time, but actually when one factor applies, the other factor also applies? You need to make sure that you're not double counting. So, statisticians would know that that's around correlation of those different factors. Sure. But, understanding the nuances around those factors, understanding what could be correlated as well. It's not just about crunching the numbers and applying your statistical tests. It's about understanding the context of the problem. What is it that you're trying to solve? And what's the best process to actually refine your analysis to get a model that best predicts the outcome that you're looking for.
Sounds extraordinarily complex enough to make my brain hurt and probably quite a few brains. But, you've obviously got quite a passion for it. And I know historically speaking, you've got some humanitarian aspects to what you've done professionally and personally. You were a volunteer breastfeeding counsellor with the ABA, Lifeline telephone crisis supporter, and even a foster carer. Do those interests and skills that you develop there then help blend into making you a better actuary when it comes to human services?
Well, I hope so, Rob. I really hope so. I've always had a passion for people and anything related to people. I have 4 little people, 4 children of my own. And my husband and I basically have a life motto, which is people before things. So, you know, you need to put people before things. Things are just stuff, you know. We all like our toys, but prioritising people and making decisions about what's right for the people is very important. So I guess, you know, winding back to high school days, what I actually thought I would do when I grew up was I wanted to become a psychologist. I've always been really fascinated by how the brain works, what makes people behave differently, what sort of things distinguish us from each other and make us different. Why do we think differently and why do we behave differently? And I've always found that really, really interesting. However, I was much better at maths than I was at English at high school. And so I just thought, you know what, I'm just never going to make it through the essays if I take psychology at uni. So stuck to the maths, did really well with that. But in parallel, have always loved anything related to people, demographics, communities, and in particular justice and equity. So, you know, I was a teenage mother and at the time I met other teenage mothers as well. And, you know, we're in our 40s now, looking at our different trajectories through life and just realising how, you know, sometimes having a little bit of extra support can really make a difference to where you go and how your life plays out. And that some people, just through sheer bad luck around the lottery of birth, end up in situations that no one would ever ask to be in. And, you know, through no fault of their own, have a lot of challenges, a lot of difficulties. And we as a community have a responsibility, I believe, to look after those people. And when people find themselves in situations where they need a hand, we should be able to rally together and help each other. So I guess governments play a role in being providers of last resort in terms of certain services. We've got a whole lot of NGOs that also deliver really important community services for people that need help. And I think even people in privileged positions, especially people in privileged positions, should be using that privilege to some extent to be able to make things better for other people who aren't as fortunate. So I really do feel passionate about that. Just as a community, I really just think that we all should be doing what we can to make sure that we've all got a minimum level of care and standard of living. So I suppose through that passion, I've in parallel with my professional work, in parallel with raising my family of little people, I've always had volunteer roles on the side that give me an opportunity to learn more and to give back to the community in a way that I can with what's available to me. And probably counselling has been one of those areas where I've done most of my work in that space. I take my hat off to the frontline workers, especially, everything we've been through over the last year with the pandemic.
Absolutely.
I think that would be a really, really tough job, having those kinds of frontline roles through such difficult times. Mental health workers, community service case workers, I just think it's incredible the work that they do. And I know personally I wouldn't be cut out to do that work full time. So I like to be able to do my professional work and supplement that with the volunteer work that I can do that can make a difference.
There's emotional intelligence is a real kind of buzzword professionally right now, and it has been for several years, I suppose. But I'm curious to know, when you are dealing with data, financial modelling, and while that emotional intelligence and life experience can give you particular insight into particular sectors, how do you determine what's giving you insight and what may be giving you your own confirmation bias when you're dealing with sort of loose data?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's one thing that you need to be really careful of. So I do a lot of work in the analytical space of child protection, so looking at data, gathering new data, helping to understand that data and interpret that data to derive insights or help make decisions about what needs to happen around child protection and how we can improve outcomes for vulnerable children. I am also an authorised foster carer and have direct experience being a foster carer, and it can be a double-edged sword. Having that personal experience and having to translate that into your professional life, because, as a foster carer, my experience, and as a mother, my experience is around those children that I've cared for and the dynamics that we've had. But that's not necessarily representative of all children or all foster children.
Sure.
So you do have to be careful, I think, when you're bringing your own personal experience to work. I think it can definitely enhance your ability to understand the context of the problem. It can enhance your ability to identify important nuances that need to be considered when you're making when you're making assumptions or when you're giving advice. But it's really important to make sure that you realise that your experience is still your experience and it's not everyone's experience. And I think I learnt that when I was a breastfeeding counsellor in my early 20s when my children were small. And to be a breastfeeding counsellor for ABA, you need to have breastfed your own babies, which is great because it means that mothers can go to a breastfeeding counsellor who has breastfed their own babies and they understand.
Sure.
But the very first thing they teach you in your counsellor training is it's about the person that you're counselling, it's not about you. Don't assume that what the mothers come to you about, don't just think, oh, I've had that problem before, I know what the answer is, because that was the answer to your problem. It's not necessarily the answer to their problem. So I think it's really good to have that lived experience when you're helping professionally, but you do really need to make sure that you're keeping that where it belongs and keeping that in context and remembering that it's not necessarily the same as everybody else's experience.
I mean, I suppose I don't know the answer to this, but I'm assuming just like, say, scientific peer-reviewed studies, you have processes and mechanics for basically cross-validating a data and trying to rule out that personal bias?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, as actuaries, often we are having to set assumptions around things. And one of the ways that we can get around that personal bias is by having several different data points to help corroborate or justify the assumption that you're setting. So at the end of the day, we're all human with our own professional experience. And in the same way that, you might see, three psychiatrists might see the same person and give three different diagnoses.
Sure, yeah.
Sometimes the same thing can happen with actuaries too. But I do think that part of our training is around the rigour of working out how do we come up with our analysis and how do we set our assumptions and how can we make sure that they're robust and justifiable.
That's interesting. And I think when you talk about gathering new data, when you're sort of working with maybe a real bare bones, think of the worst data set you've ever been given to derive an outcome. What are some of the processes used in actuarial processes to sort of derive new data?
Yeah, good question. So some of my favourite ways of deriving new data or collecting new data are through surveys and focus groups, which typically can be more sort of qualitative data capture. So qualitative researchers would be very familiar with these techniques. But it's interesting when it comes to survey design because sometimes you can actually you can collect new data and derive numerical or quantitative results out of that. So one example is I had a new manager come to me and say, Julia, I've just inherited this large workforce. I've got 60 staff here, and there's a handful of managers, and there's a lot of staff reporting to these managers. But I'm losing people, and I don't really know why. I can't understand what's happening here. I don't know why people aren't happy. They all look very capable. They're very professional, but I can't get to the bottom of it. And so I met with the managers, and they weren't really able to shed that much light. But by having some focus groups with the staff, I was able to flush out some of the key issues and the key challenges that those staff just didn't feel comfortable escalating to their managers. And then once we had those themes, I was able to run a survey to test those themes right across the whole workforce. And out of that, we were able to identify quantitatively and validate some of that qualitative data capture from the focus groups. We were able to identify what some of those issues were and who they affected, whether it was affecting everybody or whether it was just affecting one person that had told me that in the focus group. That's a really useful way of identifying and collecting additional data that can help solve a problem. So, and very specific to the issue at hand. It wasn't just picking up some data off the shelf or some data from another team. It was actually understanding what's going on here, understanding that problem, collecting the right data to understand how to solve that problem and to identify the issues.
And so the terms qualitative and quantitative data are probably very, very familiar to yourself. But can you give us a bit of a rundown of what the difference is there between the two?
Yep. So quantitative data is basically anything that's numeric. So it might be a data set from the Australian Bureau of Statistics that's counting the number of people in different areas, in different age groups. That's quantitative data, it's numbers. Qualitative data is data that you capture that's descriptive. It might not be numeric. It might be about people. It might be understanding themes about how people feel about things or people's attitudes towards things. And of course, if you collect that in a certain way, you can turn that into quantitative data. And that's one of the things that we do at Guardian Actuarial, is collecting the human element and translating that into actionable insights by being able to quantify some of those qualitative insights.
So thinking about our own experiences as people in the world, we've probably all filled out surveys at some point. Is it fair to say that quantitative data is essentially the yes-no answers in that survey, and the qualitative data is the please add free comments?
The free text, yeah. Yeah, that's a really good way to describe it. And I'd probably take it one step further and say that of that qualitative free text information, we can sometimes mine that information and turn that into quantitative insights.
Interesting. I'd ask how exactly you do that, but I guess that's the secret sauce of what it is that you do.
That's the secret sauce, Rob.
I'm curious to know, we've spoken about how actuaries are used in big business, and we're talking about massive programs for government, massive service undertakings, building new hospitals in the right areas, anything like that. Is there a role for actuarial service in a smaller context? Or is it that you need so much data and you need to be able to derive big outcomes that it doesn't necessarily, there's not a place for it in, say, small business?
So it's a good question, and I think it depends on the nature of the small business and exactly how small or large it is.
True.
But also what the problem is that needs to be solved. So I wouldn't say that actuaries are only helpful when it comes to large businesses, because actuaries often help in individual situations. So let's say there's a family law settlement, a divorce settlement,
Sure.
And husband and wife are separating up their assets, but there's some sort of asset in there that's contingent on somebody being well or somebody dying, and you need somebody to look at life expectancy type metrics to be able to work out how to divide that asset. That's an example of where an actuary might get involved. So at the very most individual level, that's one application of where we can help. But even the maths behind that, it's based on large numbers. So actuaries are making assumptions based on the law of large numbers, big, pooling risk across many people, big populations, big groups of people, because that's the way that we can robustly apply our statistical techniques. If we're making assumptions about how things might play out or what might happen in the future, it's very hard to do that for an individual person. And to, if you were to say to me, what's my life expectancy? I can give you an average. I can even do probably a little bit better than that. But on the whole, life expectancy and our statistics and our some of our numerical tools that we use as actuaries are designed to be applied to big groups of people. So when you start to drill down and want to apply that to small populations or small numbers, those techniques are not always as reliable or robust as they would be. And that's why we typically look at large populations, large workforces, large community groups when we're doing our analysis.
Interesting. So I want to segue just a little bit now, maybe for selfish reasons. I'm a real fan of machine learning, and I love messing around with machine learning. And you touched on it, that actuaries sometimes end up pushing into machine learning themselves. I'm curious to know if the ability that an actuary such as yourself has to sort of make sense of really noisy data, where it's human data, where it's it's I don't know, the life funness index or something like that. Do you find yourselves sort of working to sanitize data to ultimately end up in a machine learning style context, or do you always sort of see it through to the end to deliver a report or some statistical analysis?
So I always think with any kind of analysis project, the very first step is understanding exactly what the problem is that you're trying to solve. So look, if we're trying to build a big model that simulates everything in the world and everybody's funness factor, that's going to be a total challenge, right? Because to be able to get that and fit a robust model that gives you really sensible predictions is going to be really hard. So being able to really be clear about the problem that you're trying to solve and the parameters that are important to that problem is really critical in terms of, no matter what technique you use, whether it's just some, projection modelling in Excel or whether it's some whiz-bang machine learning or artificial intelligence, it comes down to what is the problem that you're trying to solve. So I'll give you an example. Sometimes you can really overcook these models, and it comes down to the context of the problem. So if we're looking at the number of children moving in and out of home care over a year, we don't need a very highly detailed, very refined model that's going to predict where children go each day. We need a high-level model with some high-level assumptions. If we try to over-engineer that, we're not necessarily going to get any better outcomes or any better results around that. But we still need to step back and think, okay, well, what is it that we're actually trying to model? What are we trying to predict? What are we trying to understand? And what insight is it that we're looking for from the data? Contrast that to something like, something that's very high volume, high turnover, some of your marketing examples where you're trying to sell products, you're trying to understand what drivers are behind those products and what's helping things sell and what's not. If you've got a high turnover, high volume, and things are changing over time, and the context and the drivers and the factors behind that change over time, that's a great example of where machine learning can be really helpful, because you can set things up, you understand what the important parameters are, but machine learning allows you to be able to adapt those assumptions over time in real time. So you can have that set up so that instead of having to just statically look at what the assumptions could be for your model and for your projection and your predictive factors, you can set that up so that that can be evolving as time goes on, and it can be adjusting and evolving to allow for different changes in those factors. So whether you've got changes in demographics or changes in spending, or you've got changes in other key factors that are affecting the result that you're looking for, if those things are changing over time and you'll need to be resetting those assumptions, then that's an example of where machine learning can be very helpful.
It's interesting. I'm curious to know as well. Obviously, machine learning has been around since computing, much to people's surprise when I discuss that, my favourite dinner party conversation. But I'm curious to know, over your career, which spans a little bit of time now, have you seen a change in the way people are sort of applying machine learning, which may have traditionally been an actuarial role, or are the two still very distinct?
I think the two operate in parallel. I think, if you go back to traditional actuarial work, there'd be, pens and paper and calculators and slide rules maybe.
Sure.
So certainly as computing power has improved and technology has improved as well, that's giving us more options to be able to take on some of these bigger data sets, but also more processing around those data sets too. I don't think actuaries have the monopoly on this though, and I think what we bring is slightly different to just the pure computing power behind what's possible, because certainly data analytics and data scientists are doing a lot of work in this space, not qualified as actuaries, or not always qualified as actuaries, but have a different role and are able to evolve and use these techniques as well for their work.
It's interesting. It certainly sounds like it's one is benefiting the other bidirectionally, and it's for mutual gain of us to make sense of all these crazy numbers.
Yeah,
That's good. So I want to throw to you a little bit and just see if there's anything around actuarial is it actuary or actuarial when it's or does it have to be an actuary or?
So an actuary is a person, and things that an actuary might do would be considered to be actuarial.
Actuarial, all right. We might
so
cut that bit out, we'll see.
So actuaries study actuarial studies. Actuaries do actuarial work. But yes, I am an actuary, and
can the work be considered actuarial? Just like
yes,
you sort of.
The work's actuarial.
Okay, makes sense. I'm glad we clarified that. I'm curious if there's anything, maybe misconceptions around actuarial work that you sort of come across when if you say I'm an actuary and people make assumptions about what that means, maybe to save face or maybe just because they have the wrong assumption. Is there anything that comes to mind?
So typically when someone asks me what I do and I tell them that I'm an actuary, one of two things happens. They either look at me very blankly or they go, oh, you must be really smart and good at numbers. So some people know what actuaries do, but, there's only about 2,000 qualified actuaries in Australia. So, and we don't typically support individuals. We typically support big business and the big end of town. So unless you work in a company that needs actuaries for something, most people don't know what actuaries do. So I'm not sure that there's necessarily assumptions that people make. Other than that, we're probably good with numbers, maybe smart, often quite introvert, maybe a bit nerdy.
Always a bit nerdy. It's a good thing. It's fashionable these days, so it's good.
Can be.
So you said there's only 2,000 qualified actuaries in Australia. How rigorous is the process to being formally recognised as an actuary?
It's really tough. So, I started my actuarial studies straight out of school, which is the pathway that most people take these days. You can do a Bachelor of Actuarial Studies or Actuarial Science or a commerce degree with a major in actuarial studies at a number of Australian universities. And if you get good enough marks in that, then that gives you exemptions from your first set of exams. If you don't, you have to go and do some more exams to make up for that. But then after that, you do a lot of postgraduate work, a lot of postgraduate study while you're working typically. And most actuarial employers, the bigger ones, will support their students because even after you graduate, you're still known as a student because you're still not qualified.
Lovely.
You can't call yourself an actuary until you've met certain criteria. Those criteria are often very character building as we go through many years of exams where the pass rate's often less than half. So the odds are very low of passing each of those actuarial exams. But, the standard needs to be quite high. Actuaries are trusted within our business community to be able to give important advice around key issues. So we need to ensure that we're preparing our students well for those roles and that they're ready to take on those roles and those responsibilities when they're qualified.
So it sounds pretty tough to get to make it through, but I suppose once you are a qualified actuary, you can be informing decisions that affect billions of dollars in spend.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what support exists for actuaries who are coming up? Obviously, you want to bring as many to the top as you can of the actuarial journey. Is there support for upcoming actuaries who are going through what you went through?
So look, the big companies often offer in-house training for their actuaries coming through the process. Often in those early years, the first year or two, the actuarial students are very busy completing their postgraduate actuarial exams. So there's not often a lot of time for additional training. But often once they get qualified, they're about to step into their first management role. So some of the big companies run management training for new managers. In my experience, actuaries are a little bit different to a lot of other professionals in terms of stepping up into those managerial roles, just because of the nature of the work that we do. It's not pure management. There's a real technical role around the review and the responsibility that you have over work that you're delegating to junior staff. So I run in-house training for companies, but I also run a cross-company group coaching program for new actuarial managers. And this is really useful because not only are these budding managers learning the important skills around management, but they're having an opportunity to share different experiences with other people at their same level, but in different companies. So they're able to build that camaraderie and that professional network of other managers at the same level. So whereas in a small actuarial team, they might only have people more senior to them and maybe one or two people who are junior to them, but they might not have a lot of peers at the same level that they're working. So being able to work across different companies and, share experiences with different people at the same level, it's really valuable for their future career development. But it's also a really great way to learn those skills and to learn from each other. So
yeah, always got to keep learning.
Absolutely.
We're about out of time here, but I just had a realisation that probably every person listening to this has actually encountered actuarial one way or another, whether they've walked into a hospital, taken a Centrelink payment, maybe gone into a post office. You guys really are behind massive, massive projects, and you're sort of the silent engine informing some of this government policy and infrastructure spending and everything else. Am I off base there?
I don't think you're off base, Rob, but I actually think that you're applying an actuarial view to where actuaries might be in the future. I would love for actuaries to be playing more of that behind the scenes role when it comes to government planning and government spending. At the moment, we are very limited in our application in that area. At Guardian Actuarial, we do a lot of that work, but there's a lot of government out there, and a lot of actuaries are still working in financial services, wealth management, superannuation, and insurance. But I think if there were more actuaries that were helping governments make decisions about how might things go if we don't do anything differently now, or what might happen for people, then I think we might be able to get some more better bang for our buck for our people.
That's good. Well, we may not fully understand everything that it is that you do, but Julia Lessing from Guardian Actuarial, it's been a fantastic chat. Where can people find out more about you?
Thanks, Rob. So head over to our website, www.guardianactuarial.com.au.
All right, and hopefully they can learn a little bit more about what an actuary actually does. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Rob.
There you have it. I hope you really enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please like it, share it, or leave us a review on your favourite platform. It helps us show more of this content to people just like you.